Germany, Israel, Greece,
those
all these
countries,
small, and middle powers that really stepped up and got it right. It's been quite fascinating to watch, and I think interesting to think about what the rest of us can learn from them.
Yes, I think there's much we can learn from these countries.
Kerala has done very well in India overall, and Rajasthan has not done badly either.
Yeah. It's interesting. Is that because of local leadership or?
Well, decentralization and very much local leadership and pre-existing institutions, vast network of pre-existing institutions at the local grassroots level.
Kerala had, 2-3 years ago, they had a difficult situation, Nipah virus, which is also very deadly. But they managed to contain it through very effective intervention. So they had a playbook available for that, and they deployed it, and they managed to. And there, the various social security indicators are quite high.
I see.
Yeah. Also, they have had a very women-centric form of development. I mean, they have a vast. No, well, it's not. No, there are 4.4 million women connected across the state. So it's, people talk about it, but it's very rarely implemented. They started implementing it in 1998.
Yeah.
It goes back a very long way.
Yeah, I'm only laughing because, of course, when you look across women leaders, right, in the world, many of them did very well, actually, in terms of
in fact, that's
state's response.
Couple of lists are, in our WhatsApp groups, these lists are sort of being forwarded.
Yes.
That's how women leaders, they have done better.
Yeah.
Compared to,
Exactly.
I'm a bit reluctant to put it on women leaders because these are really grassroots women. I mean, if you have 4.4 million and they're connecting with kitchens, with agriculture, with contact tracing, I think that's a very different model than simply having a woman leader at the top. So maybe that's a factor, but
it'd be interesting as an experiment to think about the way that women approached the problem and whether there were similarities across, Tsai Ing-wen and Angela Merkel and, what in New Zealand, what's her name, Jacinda Ardern, right? All of these women to see. I just be curious, and whether that sense of connectedness actually operates at a macro level as well as a micro level. I don't know. I haven't certainly. I deal with China. There's no issue there about women leaders. They only have one in the top 25. So that's not going to play a strong role. But yeah, I think it is interesting.
I'll mute myself. Hi, Pat.
Hello, Patricia. Patricia, you are muted.
I'm afraid so. I have muted everyone, and no one will be able to unmute themselves until the question and answer session.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And in any case, it is 6:28 now. We are live on YouTube and recording, so we can start in another 2 minutes.
Okay.
And should I keep myself muted, I guess, when I'm not speaking, right?
No. So I think Dr. Sharan, the ambassador, and you, the three of you can just stay unmuted throughout, since the first half of the discussion will mainly involve you. And then the question and answer session will be different.
But can I suggest that you mute us also once we are done introducing, making our initial comments? Because
we can mute ourselves at that time.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Samanvay, shall we start?
Sure, sir. We can go ahead. Yes, over to you.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. And of course, good morning to Dr. Elizabeth Economy. On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies and the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, let me extend a very warm welcome to all of you to the 14th Giri Deshingkar Memorial Lecture to be delivered by eminent China scholar, Dr. Elizabeth C. Economy. Welcome, Liz. It's a great pleasure.
So
it's a great pleasure to have you with us through video link. Thanks a lot for joining us at this early hour in the USA. I'm good to know and feeling less guilty that you're early riser. So it's not exactly a very early morning for you.
No.
Thanks nevertheless. We hope to be able to see you in person before long once we emerge out of the present trying circumstances resulting from the COVID pandemic. The CSDS and the ICS jointly initiated the Giri Deshingkar Memorial Lecture in 2001 to celebrate the life and contributions of one of our most respected and pioneering Chinese scholars, who was much more than a narrowly focused area specialist. He was a historian with a deep knowledge of China's history, culture, literature, as also economy, politics, foreign and strategic affairs. He brought a multidisciplinary approach to China studies, promoting collaboration of scholars from different humanities and social sciences backgrounds, and seeking to promote a holistic and nuanced understanding of China in an Indian setting. He was a great China scholar, but his interests went well beyond China to include Asia and the Asian identity and issues relating to war, peace, disarmament, and development. Professor Deshingkar was also a teacher and a mentor of a generation of emerging Chinese scholars in India. He was an institution builder who helped nurture the ICS and the CSDS. In fact, he headed both these institutions as director at different periods. We pay our tribute to him when in the ICS, we have just completed marking 50 years of the institute and its precursor, the China Study Group, which he helped set up in 1969, along with a group of equally motivated and passionate China scholars and practitioners. We also recall Professor Deshinkar's contributions to fostering China Report, the only peer-reviewed academic journal on China coming out from India. He was the editor of China Report, which remains vibrant as the flagship journal of the ICS and has now entered the 56th year of its publication. It's most befitting that this evening we have with us to deliver this prestigious lecture, Dr. Elizabeth Economy, the CBS Star Senior Fellow and Director for Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, New York, and a distinguished visiting fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. As all of you are aware, Dr. Economy is a highly respected China scholar who has several critically acclaimed and prize-winning books to her credit. Her most recent book, The Third Revolution, Xi Jinping and the Chinese State, is widely considered as an essential reading to understand the present political landscape in China under Xi Jinping and its regional and global ambitions, priorities, and preoccupations. Liz Economy is an exceptionally perceptive and clear-eyed observer and interpreter of what's happening in China today. Dr. Economy will speak on a theme which is engaging all of us, US-China relations in the era of Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. It's a relationship which has deteriorated sharply in recent years and entered a new phase of profound competition over geostrategic concerns, economic interests, and fundamental political values, as Dr. Economy puts it. There is now serious talk of a new Cold War breaking out between the two countries. Dr. Economy will help us understand the underlying issues, including domestic factors in each country contributing to the Sino-US rivalry and its broader implications for other countries and for the future role of China and the USA globally. We'd also like her to tell us about the impact of the COVID pandemic and the upcoming election in the USA on the trajectory of the US-China strategic contestation. Liz, we're all looking forward to your lecture. Before that, let me invite Professor Avdendra Sharan, Acting Director, CSDS, to make his remarks. Over to you, Avdendra.
Thank you, Mr. Kanta. I'll be very brief. You have said much that had to be said about the speaker and about Giri. Let me first of all welcome everyone on behalf of the Center for Study of Developing Societies and the Institute of Chinese Studies. We have jointly organized this lecture over a number of years, and it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Economy today evening to deliver the lecture. Professor Giri Deshingkar, whose memory and scholarship we celebrate today, joined the CSDS sometime in the 1970s and went on to serve as its director from 1987 to 92. His interests in China, as Mr. Kanta said, were deep and abiding and covered a wide range, from Chinese history, culture, and literature to economy, politics, and foreign affairs. He also, towards the latter half of his career, took a great deal of interest in science, technology, and security issues, on which he wrote fairly regularly. I'm also told he was a fantastic cook, made some wonderful Chinese dishes, but I have no personal testimonies to offer on that count. But his friends often say that he's a wonderful cook, and it was always a pleasure to have him around. In addition, as Mr. Kanta mentioned, he had a deep passion for building institutions, and both the CSDS and ICS owe a lot to Giri. He made major contributions to setting up these institutes, to running them, and also, in addition to the work of the institute, he had an interest in a number of other issues, especially in issues related to peace, and made a major contribution to the United Nations University Program on Peace and Global Transformation. Our founder, director, Professor Rajni Kothari, fondly remembered him. And he wrote a brief introduction to Giri's work and life of scholarship, in which he mentions two things which I think are fairly important in our times. One, that Giri provided, in Professor Kothari's work, an important voice of independent thinking in both Asian affairs and international relations. And second, that while Giri did start as an area specialist, he went on to become, again, Professor Kothari's words, an original and distinguished scholar at large, something to which Mr. Kanta also alluded, that he had a range of interests on which he wrote, both about China and other places. Sadly, Giri passed away too soon in November 2000, and since 2001, this lecture has been instituted in his memory. The first lecture was delivered by Professor Prasenjit Dwara in 2002, and a number of eminent speakers have delivered this lecture since, most recently Mark Elliott. This evening's lecture, as Mr. Kanta mentioned, is being delivered by Dr. Elizabeth Economy. Given the special circumstances in which this lecture is being organized, I must express my regret, both on behalf of ICS and CSDS, that there can be no reception. But we do hope that the lecture will more than make up for it. With those words, let me invite Professor Economy once again and request Mr. Kanta to chair the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sharan, for those remarks, especially recalling the multifaceted personality of Professor Giri Deshingkar, or Giri as he was popularly and fondly known as. Before I invite Dr. Elizabeth Economy to deliver a lecture, let me explain a few things. Dr. Economy will be delivering a lecture for about 30-35 minutes, when we'll mute all participants, in fact, all other participants. In fact, everyone is muted except 3 of us. Thereafter, Dr. Economy has kindly agreed to take questions from the participants. You may indicate your interest in asking questions by using the raise hand option available at the bottom of the list of participants. You may also send me questions through the chat option. I will call on participants to ask their questions during the Q&A session. The concerned participants will unmute himself or herself. Other participants are requested to keep themselves muted so that we don't have any background ambient noise to disturb the proceedings. Now I have great pleasure inviting Dr. Elizabeth Economy to deliver the 14th Giri Deshingkar Memorial Lecture. Over to you, Liz.
Thank you so much, both Dr. Sharan and you, Ashok, Dr. Kanta, for inviting me to speak with you about US-China relations at this critically important moment. It really is a great honor to be selected to deliver the 14th Giri Deshingkar Memorial Lecture Although I never had the opportunity to meet him, I am an admirer of the clarity of his thought, the directness of his prose, and the range and depth of his expertise. I am also sorry that I cannot be there in person. I have been to Delhi a number of times and have always enjoyed the opportunity to engage with my colleagues there. However, I am grateful that technology enables us to communicate even in this most challenging time of the COVID-19 pandemic. What I'd like to do this evening is just to share some thoughts on the US-China relationship, how dramatically that relationship has changed over the past few years, why I think it's changed, and if there's time, what we might anticipate moving forward. And then, of course, I will very much welcome your questions and comments. And I know, as I said, I've been to Delhi a number of times. I know there will be a lot of thoughts, and I look forward to learning from all of you. So broadly speaking, there has been a dramatic shift in how the US foreign policy community understands China under Xi Jinping, its intentions and its capabilities. And this has led to a rethink and a reset of US policy. I like to quote my friend Wang Jise, the former head of Peking University's School of International Relations, who said in an October 2018 interview, US policy has changed because China has changed. But to understand the precise nature of that change in US policy, it is important to look to changes in the US political landscape, namely the election of Donald Trump as president of the United States in 2016. So let me take that as my starting point. First outline, I think, 4 key ways in which China has changed under Xi Jinping that I think have contributed to the transformation in US understanding of China, and then talk more explicitly about the nature of the US policy change. Taken together, these 4 shifts in Chinese policy signaled to the United States that political and economic reform and opening in China had not only stalled, but were in reverse, and that on the global stage, China was prepared to directly challenge US leadership and the international rules-based order. So the first shift is really Xi Jinping's move away from Deng Xiaoping's collective form of leadership to a more one-man authoritarian style of leadership. Xi has amassed an enormous amount of institutional power. He sits on top of most of the important committees and commissions that oversee broad swaths of Chinese domestic and foreign policy, everything from economic reform and development to cybersecurity. He's launched a massive anti-corruption campaign that each year results in the detention of more Chinese officials than the year before. In 2018, there were more than 600,000 Chinese officials who were detained on charges of corruption. The year before that, it was about 500,000. Many people ask, is this anti-corruption campaign for real, or is it just an opportunity for Xi Jinping to get rid of his political opponents? And the answer is it's both. He genuinely believes that corruption could be, as he said, the death of the Chinese Communist Party and even the death of the Chinese state if it were not addressed. But at the same time, there was a great study that was done by a professor at Harvard that indicated that if you look at the level of vice minister or above, within the first few years of the anti-corruption campaign, you'd find that about 40% of the people that were targeted in the anti-corruption campaign were in some way tied in to Xi Jinping's political competitors. We also see evidence of efforts to develop a cult of personality. There are over 150 institutes now in China that are devoted just to the idea of Xi Jinping thought. There is, of course, the famous app that all Chinese Communist Party members, more than 90 million of them, must now have on their phone and spend at least a few hours every week studying the thoughts, words and actions of Xi Jinping, then being quizzed on them and forced to turn in their quiz scores to local party secretaries. This is a type of thing that I think nobody would have anticipated happening in China during the years preceding Xi Jinping's arrival. Most significantly, perhaps, Xi Jinping upended the 2-term limit on the presidency. This was something that Deng Xiaoping had put in place back in 1982 as a mechanism of ensuring that China would avoid the type of chaos that Mao Zedong was able to inflict both during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution on China, that concentration of power in the hands of one man. But Xi Jinping managed, I think, to the great dismay of many people, both in and outside China, to remove that constitutional provision And he may now hold all three of the most important positions: president of the country, general secretary of the Communist Party, and chairman of the Central Military Commission for life. I think it's important to remember, of course, that institutional authority doesn't necessarily equate with legitimacy. And one thing that we've seen over the course of this pandemic was that very significant voices of dissent emerged in China. There were public intellectuals who directly criticized Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, journalists who traveled to Wuhan, to the epicenter of the pandemic, to report on what was really taking place on the ground, to question official Chinese government reports. The financial journal Caixin, which is very well regarded both in and outside China, at one point said there were more than 500,000 cases, while the Chinese government was reporting 83,000 cases. And lawyers have banded together to support people who wanted to sue the government on behalf of loved ones who died. Of course, most of these people have been arrested since then, but I do think it's an important reminder that simply because we don't see evidence of dissent and discontent and civil society within China the way that we did prior to the advent of Xi Jinping in 2012, it doesn't mean that these things don't continue to exist within China. The second big shift under Xi Jinping has been the reassertion of the Chinese Communist Party back into the everyday life of the Chinese people and the Chinese economy. One of the hallmarks of the Deng era was the withdrawal of the party from many aspects of common everyday life and the Chinese economy. But Xi Jinping has really reasserted the power of the Chinese Communist Party. And the most obvious way that we see this, of course, is through the massive surveillance system that the Chinese government has put in place through cameras and phones and computers. The Chinese government tracks its citizens. It has the most sophisticated facial recognition system in the world. It's moving forward on voice recognition and gait recognition. So even if you can disguise yourself one way, the Chinese government will find some other way to track you down. And of course, the most extreme manifestation of this system is what's taken place in Xinjiang, which is nothing less than a police state at this point. Interestingly, I think the pandemic also raised questions about privacy, and we're seeing this more and more among Chinese citizens and the urban middle class, or concerns about government intrusion. And Robin Li, who is one of the founders of Baidu, for example, he's a member of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, and during the discussions just this past spring, he raised the issue of whether or not the government shouldn't be rolling back some of the more intrusive technological capabilities that it put in place during the pandemic, whether they shouldn't take those back after the pandemic had basically subsided, which I think is quite interesting. For multinationals, I think there are two concerns about this reassertion of the Chinese Communist Party. First, the enhanced role of party committees within joint ventures. One of the things that Xi Jinping has pushed is to have party committees, which are basically just the committees that are made up of party members in any firm, but to have these committees play an increasing role in determining things like the investment decisions of firms, right? So when I was doing the research for my most recent book, for example, I spoke with the head of a major German subsidiary of a major German conglomerate who's based in China. And he told me that the party committee had come to him and said that they wanted this firm to invest in a certain province in China. And he said, we have no interest and no reason to invest there. They wanted it done for economic development purposes. So pushed back and the party had retreated. Nonetheless, this sense that somehow the party is going to play a greater role in the decision-making process of firms is one concern. And the second is really the application of the social credit system to multinationals. And the social credit system, of course, is this effort on the part of the Communist Party to evaluate the political and economic trustworthiness of its citizens, right? Using everything from the court system to phones, to individuals monitoring people's behavior on the street, to cameras on trains, to say, how well are you behaving? And they've had about 40 pilot projects underway for a number of years, but the idea is basically to sort of take into account a number of different factors. Every different pilot project had a different set of metrics, everything from, have you repaid your debts to, did you misbehave? Did you jaywalk? Did you participate in a protest? All of these can contribute to your social credit score, and then to develop a system of rewards or punishments based on your score. And at the same time now, in 2020, they are rolling out the same kind of social credit score for multinationals. And there are supposed to be as many as 300 different metrics on which these companies will be evaluated. It can be everything from, simply things like, are you adhering to China's environmental protection laws? But also it could be, are you sourcing from Chinese suppliers, right? So it could be a very important mechanism for the Chinese government to exert greater political and economic control over multinationals. So that reassertion of the role of the Communist Party is the second significant shift that has caused some concern in the United States. The third is what I would call a virtual network of restrictions and regulations that helps Xi Jinping to control what comes in and what goes out of the country. Deng Xiaoping often said that China had a lot to learn from the outside world. He welcomed foreign capital and foreign ideas into China. But Xi very much views the outside world as, is often termed hostile foreign forces. And, most clearly we see that, of course, in the growing control of the Chinese government over the internet in China. But there are a number of other ways, and let me just point to two that I think have been particularly important in the context of the US-China relationship. The first is a law that came into force in January of 2017 to manage foreign non-governmental organizations. And before the law was passed, there were over 7,000 foreign NGOs working in China, mostly on issues like environmental protection or poverty alleviation and education. And they were a major source of capacity building for Chinese non-governmental organizations in an area where I have long focused on the environment. For example, there was a point in time when foreign NGOs and foundations were responsible for about 90% of the funding of domestic environmental NGOs. And you'd have many of the heads of these Chinese environmental non-governmental organizations going abroad, coming to the United States, for example, and spending a few months with American NGOs learning how to fundraise or to manage an NGO. So a really extraordinary level of interaction, right, and civil society partnership that was taking place. But in the wake of the passage of that law, which moved control of foreign NGOs from the Ministry of Civil Society to the Ministry of Public Security, which already tells you sort of the change in how foreign NGOs were being viewed in the Xi Jinping administration, right, as a threat, a potential threat to national security. That number has dropped precipitously, and with it, it has really undercut one of the two most important pillars of support for a robust US-China relationship in the United States, namely the sort of civil society, people-to-people kind of relationship. The second, I think, example of how Xi Jinping has moved to limit foreign engagement is through the sort of Made in China 2025 effort. And this, as I'm sure many of you are aware, was a program that was initiated in 2015. And the idea was basically that Chinese firms should control somewhere between 80 and 90% of manufacturing in China across 10 sort of significant areas of cutting edge technology, everything from artificial intelligence to medical devices, to new energy vehicles, to new materials. And so many people look at the Trump administration and think the Trump administration is really the engineer of the decoupling process. But in point of fact, China had already begun the process of trying to take control of developing its own supply chain, of managing and controlling its own supply chain across all of these 10 areas, beginning in 2015. Certainly the Trump administration has accelerated that process. But nonetheless, I think it's important to recognize sort of what China was trying to accomplish, several years before the Trump administration, in fact, started to push ahead on this front. So that's the third shift. And the fourth shift, of course, is the move away from Deng Xiaoping's low-profile foreign policy to a much more ambitious and expansive foreign policy under Xi Jinping. And let me just tick off quickly 4 areas where I think this is particularly noteworthy. The first is in terms of moving from staking claims around sovereignty to realizing them. And we see this in the South China Sea, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, even in the midst of the pandemic, China made moves in each one of these areas, right, to advance its claims. And certainly we saw in June, China taking steps to exacerbate tensions on the border between India and China that resulted in a significant loss of life. So one is in this area of sort of sovereignty. The second for the United States has been a growing concern over Chinese economic and political activities within the United States. So whether political influence through Confucius Institutes or Chinese government officials' influence over Chinese students in American universities, the hollowing out of core US technological advantages through the acquisition of US companies or investments in startups or intellectual property theft within universities or via cyber theft. All of these have become a source of very significant concern in the United States in ways that they were not previously. Belt and Road Initiative, of course, is China's grand scale infrastructure initiative that Xi Jinping announced in 2013. It began really as an effort to export Chinese overcapacity, to link lesser developed parts of the country to external markets. It was all about hard infrastructure. But as we've seen over the past 7 years, it has morphed and evolved into something far more ambitious, right? There's the digital Silk Road, that's fiber optic cables and e-commerce and satellite systems. There's the Polar Silk Road to connect China to Europe more directly. There are efforts, China developed its first military logistics base in Djibouti, concerns that there are more bases, I think, to come. Certainly China's control over many ports, more than 70 in more than 35 countries, gives rise to concerns that, the PLA may be able to not only to dock, but may be developing, more permanent presence in some of these countries, and then political influence. And I should say this is a source of some debate in the United States, certainly, the degree to which China is attempting to export its political values. I tend to be on one side of the debate, which is to say that when Xi Jinping says that the China model is one that other countries can emulate, and you look to see that China is conducting cybersecurity seminars through its Belt and Road countries and helping Tanzanian officials to control dissent and do real-time monitoring of the internet, that we should take him at his word. And then in fact, China is using the Belt and Road and other mechanisms to export authoritarianism. But many people think that in fact, these are all defensive measures and we don't need to be so concerned about this. And then finally, Xi Jinping's call for China to lead in the reform of the global governance system. And I think here, if we look at the United Nations, China is putting forth many, many new initiatives around human rights, around internet governance. It has pushed its Belt and Road Initiative, through more than 24 different UN agencies and programs. And I think there is some justification for the concern that has been voiced globally, not just by the United States, but by other countries as well, about China's influence in the World Health Organization, and whether or not that did contribute to the WHO perhaps not being as forward-leaning as it should have been in its recommendations to the rest of the international community as the pandemic began to spread. So for the United States, I think these 4 shifts, point to a China that is both more repressive and authoritarian at home, more ambitious and expansive abroad. And this has 2 important implications. First, that China now directly challenges US values and interests across a wide spectrum of issues. And second, that the traditional US policy of engage but hedge is no longer adequate for managing the relationship with China. So now let me quickly pivot to how the US has responded. The transformation from the Obama administration policy during 2012 and 2016 to the Trump administration policy from 2017 until today has been stark. The Obama administration approach was really classic engage but hedge. Basically, this meant that the Obama administration worked to integrate China into the current international system in the belief that China would develop the necessary norms and institutions that would not only make it a responsible stakeholder in the liberal international order, but that it would also encourage progress on domestic political and economic reform. The hedge element of this, of course, was working with allies and partners to maintain leverage in case China didn't move along this path. By the end of the Obama administration, however, I think the overall assessment, even within the administration itself, was that with the exception of the climate partnership, which contributed to the Paris Climate Accords, and for a short while, the cyber agreement between the United States and China, that the US had ended up in a relatively weaker position vis-a-vis China. China hadn't made any of its promised progress on economic reform. It flat out broke its promise to President Obama not to militarize the artificial features that it created in the South China Sea. It was adopting highly coercive policies toward Taiwan, and it was working to change values and norms around human rights and internet governance through its Belt and Road Initiative and United Nations. I would say there was mounting concern in and outside the administration about China's expanding influence, but after more than 3 decades, really, of the US following the same policy, and believing that it was really the only credible policy, no matter how well it worked, the idea was that, yes, this was a long and tortuous process, but eventually we would get there. It was very difficult to change course. The election of Donald Trump, however, introduced a radically different set of foreign policy actors and ideas into the mix. The most significant, of course, was certainly Trump himself, but also many of his top advisors, Secretary Lighthizer, Secretary Peter Navarro, Matt Pottinger in the NSC, Randy Schriver in DOD, all had very deep concerns about China. They reassessed and they reset US policy. I characterize it as moving from a policy of engage but hedge to an approach of compete, counter, and contain. The Trump administration saw China as a revisionist power and a strategic competitor. But I think what's really important to note, and I think what's also missed in all of the focus on President Trump and his tweets and the general chaos that surrounds him, is that from the very beginning of the Trump administration, there really have been 2 separate China policies that have emerged from this administration. First, there's President Trump's approach. President Trump, as I'm sure you all know, has articulated a framework of America First, which speaks to the US's place in the international system, but also very directly to how the United States should approach China. In practical terms, it means the United States no longer wants to bear the burden of global leadership. President Trump sees US leadership as unfair and costly and understands multilateral institutions and allies as constraints on US interests and power rather than as enablers of US influence. His 3rd day in office, he pulled the US out of the end stage negotiations of the TPP. 6 months after that, he announced his intentions to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord, pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. He's announced that he's pulling out of the World Health Organization, and on and on. Periodically, he threatens to dissolve alliances, withdraw troops from Japan and South Korea unless they pay more for the privilege of hosting the troops. And as we saw during the pandemic, America First also means that the president is not interested in forging consensus on global challenges. US leadership has fallen dramatically short, both at home and abroad. The president has a preference for unilateral action and bilateral negotiation. From this America First platform, he also derived his priorities with regard to China, namely trade and North Korea. These are the 2 issues that he believes are most directly and immediately important to the welfare of the American people. And these are the 2 issues that he has pursued almost to the exclusion of all else relative to China. But the president's approach doesn't really capture the entirety of US policy toward China. In many respects, his narrow focus has allowed for others in his administration to advance a much more expansive effort that reflects a much stronger commitment to US leadership on the global stage, a far more internationalist and multilateral approach to US foreign policy, and a much broader range of issues that are considered critical to US interests than the president naturally supports. This second set of foreign policy priorities, I would argue, is broadly shared by senior members of the Trump administration, Congress, and the US military. Let me just offer a couple of examples, and then I'll tie up with a point or 2 about looking ahead, and then open the floor. So one of the most noteworthy elements of this policy, of this broader policy, is the framework of the Quad and the free and open Indo-Pacific. These were ideas, of course, that were introduced by Japan over a decade ago, and of which India is one pillar, along with Japan, Australia, and the United States. The revival and the expansion of this notion represents an important effort to support norms of the international rules-based order, including freedom of navigation, free and fair trade, sovereignty, and good governance. And if you look across a wide range of US policy and initiatives and actions over the past 3.5 years, I think you'll see these ideas reflected very clearly. So for example, in the South China Sea, the United States has not only increased its own freedom of navigation operations from 4 in 2017 to 9 in 2019, but has encouraged Australia, India, Vietnam, Japan, the UK, and France to reinforce freedom of navigation norms with their own naval activities. With regard to the Belt and Road, the US has led the call for countries to take a second look at how their Belt and Road deals are structured and the debt that might be incurred. The US Congress passed the BUILD Act that created an entirely new institution, the Development Finance Corporation, where multinationals from all countries can go for financing on preferential terms for high quality infrastructure projects. And it created the Blue Dot Network with Japan and Australia to provide consulting and certification process for businesses and countries to ensure quality control and infrastructure development. Similarly, the United States is now leading the charge within the United Nations to push back against Chinese efforts to use the UN to advance its own domestic policy concerns. Look, President Trump does not care about the United Nations. He's called it, no friend of the United States. But the US has called China out for using the UN to advance the Belt and Road Initiative. For example, it pushed back against Chinese efforts in 2019 to include the Belt and Road in the UN reauthorization bill, in the reauthorization bill for the UN mission to Afghanistan. I mean, China twice threatened to veto the reauthorization bill if it didn't have the Belt and Road included, but the United States, and others, stood strong, and the bill did not include the Belt and Road. And of course, in large measure, China's failure to lead, to get the presidency, the head of the World Intellectual Property Organization this past spring was due to US lobbying efforts. It would have made the 5th UN agency, specialized agency of the United Nations that China would have held the top position, 5 out of 15, far more than any other country. And then finally, I think it may come as a surprise, but the United States has maintained and even in some ways amplified its efforts to promote human rights and democracy. And if any of you have seen the excerpts from the Bolton, John Bolton's book or read it, I've only seen what's been in the news. I can't bring myself to buy the book and pay them money to support him, but I have read some of the excerpts. But it's clear that the president does not care about human rights, but Congress does. And the US has strongly supported Hong Kong democracy activists with the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, now the Hong Kong Autonomy Act. It's sanctioning companies that do business in Xinjiang and officials that are responsible for the repression. Has provided very strong support for Taiwan, and is bringing Taiwan in as a partner on democracy activities in the Indo-Pacific. So I think it's just important as we take a look at what's transpired in terms of US policy toward China over the past 3.5 years, not simply to focus on President Trump and what he says and what he does, but to look at the totality of the US policy toward China. One final point, I think within the United States, there is a very strong concern, as I mentioned earlier, about Chinese economic and political activities. And this has contributed to rising anti-Chinese sentiment more broadly through the US population, but also, of course, to this push toward decoupling, not only against Huawei, but more broadly concerns about US technology advantages, developing trusted supply chains, and somehow preventing China from hollowing out the US technology industry. So where does all of this leave us? Probably the worst moment, worst time in US-China relations since Tiananmen in 1989. I think there's widespread, although not uniformly held belief that China poses a systemic challenge that is bent on advancing its system globally and undermining the liberal international order, that is stealing technology, that it wants to replace the US as the dominant power in East Asia and globally. And COVID-19 only reinforced a sense within the United States that China could not be trusted. At this point, there is no formal dialogue outside of the trade dialogue going on between the United States and China. So what might change with the Biden administration? Let me just make a couple of very quick points. First, I don't think that the fundamental understanding of China is going to change. I think the rhetoric will change. I do think that there will be more debate. There will be more voices that will argue for a better understanding of how US actions affect China, perhaps a push, a greater reluctance to punish China without having a sense for whether or not there will be a real impact. Certainly, there will be a turn back to the United States considering and leading on issues around global challenges, more of an emphasis from the president, not simply members of his administration, on partnerships and allies, a greater focus on developing US resilience, so investing in the United States at home, and perhaps, I think, looking to try to find an area or two of common ground and common purpose with China to keep that Cold War that Ashok mentioned at the outset, to keep those lines from hardening. So let me stop there. I hope I've piqued your interest and have provoked some questions, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Liz, for that brilliant lecture, for bringing out with such great clarity, lucidity, and understanding how US-China relations have changed so dramatically in recent years. You pointed out that US-China relations have changed, and China has changed. You have brought out various major shifts that have taken place in both China's domestic politics and its foreign policies, and how those changes have influenced the whole context of US-China relations. You argued that the change started taking place during Obama presidency, when there were a whole lot of concerns about China, but then policies pursued over 3 decades, those policies essentially continued until President Trump and his administration brought into being a radically different approach towards China, when the shift, as you argued, took place from engage and hedge to counter and contain China. You also brought out some changes that might take place if we have Biden presidency come November elections in the USA. You have, as you mentioned, given much food for thought. I'm sure there'll be a whole lot of questions. We look forward to a very stimulating dialogue. Before I start the Q&A session, it gives me great pleasure to recognize the presence with us this evening of Ms. Priya Deshingkar, daughter of Professor Giri Deshingkar. Thank you very much, Priya, for joining us this evening. Now we will start the Q&A. Priya would like to say something?
No, I'm just absolutely delighted. It's actually the first time that I've been able to attend one of these memorials.
I know, that's why we are so happy that you are with us.
So much pressure.
This is fantastic. And I really enjoyed Liz's lecture and learned so much about China and the US relations, as well as their respective policies. So thank you for that. And thank you for all the wonderful tributes to my father. It really makes my heart swell with pride and remembering him in this way. Lovely. Thank you.
Thanks.
Really a joy to be here.
Thank you very much, Priya. Now we'll start the Q&A session. We have with us Jyoti Malhotra, who is National and Strategic Affairs Editor of The Print. Print is our media partner for the event. And we'll start the Q&A by inviting Jyoti to raise some questions. Jyoti, will you unmute yourself and start?
Yes, thank you so much, Ambassador Kantha. Thank you for asking me to ask the first question. And thank you, Professor Economy. It was fascinating to listen to you on the US and China. My first question is about where we sit here in India. You know that Indian and Chinese troops have begun the process of withdrawal in Ladakh. These are the first reports that have come in, and there are reports also that the special representatives of India and China have been in touch with each other. Now, this is happening in the wake, again, newspaper reports say, in the wake of conversations between India and the US, and a growing closeness, a partnership, if you like, between India and the US on countering and containing. These are your words, and I don't know if India is going to be party to that. But what are your views on this?
Well, thank you for the question. I mean, again, I'm sure everybody on this in this discussion is aware that the United States, longs for a greater partnership with India, and that we recognize that India is reluctant to, jump to one side or jump to another side. Obviously, there are complicating factors. India's strong ties with Russia. The fact that it is a neighboring country, shares a very long border with China. It wants to increase its trade opportunities with China. I think we recognize all of this. But I also think that the Indian government sees challenges that Xi Jinping poses, not only in terms of its own border, but more broadly, perhaps, in the Indo-Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, in areas that India has traditionally considered its own backyard. And I think, in terms of India as the largest democracy in the world, we do share values and commitment to norms that underpin the liberal international order. And so even if it's not about, a US-India partnership, or I've seen some reports that have said maybe India can join the Five Eyes, which I think would be very difficult to accomplish. But I think in terms of a commitment to shared norms, that this ought to be, an area where India and the United States can find common ground and purpose to push back against China. And it's the Trump administration that is countering and containing. It's not my personal policy.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ambassador. That's all I have right now.
Thank you, Jyoti. Now I'll invite Ambassador Deshingkar Menon, our former National Security Advisor and Chairman of Advisory Board of ICS, to ask the next question or questions. Ambassador Menon.
Thank you, Ashok, and thank you, Dr. Economy, for that really brilliant lecture. I think that was really, it opened our eyes to a lot of things. But I want to go back to where you started. You said China has changed. Do you think China could change back? It's an unfair question, I realize.
It can't change back, but it can change forward, right? And yes, I don't think that this is the end of Chinese history. And I firmly believe that, as we saw, in the midst of the pandemic, that there are strong voices and even within the very top leadership, that there are concerns about Xi Jinping and overreach and disagreements about how best to pursue China's national interest. And again, merely because we're not privy to them, doesn't publish everything in the media the way that it does in India and the United States, doesn't mean that there aren't these discussions and debates going on, and that there won't be strong push in the future for a more open political system, and one that would be more in line with sort of the values that are represented in the liberal international order. Having said that, I don't think it will be easy for China to get there at this point in time. And I do think it will. I don't expect Xi Jinping to have some new awakening, for example. I think it will require real push within the top echelons of the Chinese leadership. I think a sense, a majority within the top 7 of the Standing Committee of the Politburo to say that Xi Jinping has pushed things too far. It could have been that the pandemic might have served as that inflection point. It doesn't appear that it has, but I think we can see some of the fault lines in the system. So just as I don't believe that engagement, should be over and that engagement didn't work, as some of my good friends and colleagues have argued. I think engagement has had a profound impact on China. I also don't believe that China can never, emerge from this period and reform politically and economically.
So will you have another question, sir? Okay. For our next question, I'll move to chat box. Tilak Jha, here's a question. Tilak would like to ask you a question directly. Please unmute yourself.
No, sir, I think I have typed the question. It's primarily that, do you see the US ready to play second fiddle to China in the coming years? If and technology gap keeps shifting in favor of Beijing. And if not, do you see the US doing enough to ensure it remains on the top of these charts?
Yeah, thanks. No, I don't think that the United States is ready to play second fiddle to China. I think that there's a strong presumption within the United States, both sides of the political aisle, Democrats and Republicans, that the United States both wants and needs for the greater good, both of the United States and much of the rest of the world, to remain a leading power. And in terms of the technology race, look, I think we're beginning to delve more deeply in a more granular way into the areas where China actually does have a real advantage and where the US really retains a significant advantage. And there is, a lot of hype that comes out of Beijing, around things like, China is going to be dominant in artificial intelligence simply as a result of the massive data that it is going to have access to. And while initially I think the US has been on the defense and we've been like, oh my gosh, actually now we're beginning to look and see that in many areas, that's simply not the case. And in AI, for example, it's not all about how much data you have access to. And similarly, we look to see the difference between, what's called invention and innovation. And when you look at sort of areas of basic research and where you have breakthrough technologies, it is still the case that the United States and other countries lead, whereas China is much more still in the vein of innovation and process innovation. And when you think about sort of the amazing companies that China has produced, like Alibaba or Tencent or even Huawei, it's really not about their own technological breakthrough inventions that has set them apart and ahead. So I think, we still have room, but it will require us to dig back down in, to recommit to investing in our educational system and in our research. But I actually am not, I am not so worried about that. As long as we move forward in the next election, I feel reasonably confident that the United States can move ahead.
Thanks, Liz. The next question is from Beena Agrawal. Well, you have partly answered this question. Beena would like to know whether you expect US policies towards China to change substantially if there is a Biden presidency compared to policies President Trump is pursuing. If so, in what direction? Will he go back to Obama's approach? If not, what kind of changes you emphasize if there is Biden presidency?
Sure. I mean, I think, again, that there will be some tempering of rhetoric, certainly. I think there will be an effort to find areas of common purpose and common ground. Hopefully, we'll get back on board with climate change and, partnership and coordination with China on that front. I think in areas like pandemics, I think there will be a sense that these issues of sort of global import are areas where we should try to forge a common approach, or at least a coordinated approach. But in terms, again, of our fundamental understanding of China and the direction in which it's moving and the challenges that it poses to the United States, to fundamental values and interests of the United States, I don't anticipate that that is going to change. In terms of the decoupling effort, the pushback on Huawei, I think these things have been put in motion. And there may be an effort to look at things, as we say, to use a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer. In some respects, the Trump administration has, rethought the policy, has reset it, and now maybe it's time to recalibrate it. But again, I think the fundamentals of US understanding are not going to change.
Thanks. For next question, I invite Ambassador Saurav Kumar. He has raised his hand to ask the question.
Thank you.
Saurav, can you unmute yourself? Yeah.
Can you hear me? Thank you. Thank you very much for a very good presentation. You mentioned US-China policies, US policy towards China at two levels, President Trump and the administration. My question is about that. His approach, disappointment with multilateral institutions, has left the multilateral institutions entirely or largely at the mercy of the Chinese, out to expand their influence. The WHO is a prime example, very concrete and recent one. Instead of working to correct the deficiencies in preparing for the next pandemic, which is a very real possibility, he abdicated by withdrawing. Now my question is, what about the second level of US policy and the academia? Is there concern? Has there been work to show that US would have been better off being inside, tackling the problem from within, WHO in particular, and setting limits, and easily the question of transparency. Why should international organizations depend so much on the level number one who can block its functioning, as it happened in this case? There were people who knew what's happening, they wanted to do, but possibly because of the one person at the top, the organizational functioning was stymied. Now, this is a prime case for reform, governance reform in multilateral institutions. So we've left the fool. So this is, I have another question, if the chair will allow later, that is about China. Thank you very much.
Great question. I think, yes, the Trump administration policy can be seen as an effort to deny Chinese leadership, while at the same time not actually advancing a very affirmative case, right, within these international institutions. And so I think that is an area where a Biden administration would do things differently. There is widespread agreement in many parts of the academy that the United States needs to re-engage, right? And so at every step of the president's withdrawal from various different international multilateral institutions and his threats, there are huge outcries of concern from the broader US foreign policy community. I think there is, again, recognition among many that these institutions need to be reformed. But in order to do that, right, you have to be engaged. And so, again, I expect that a Biden presidency will both say, yes, this did not function well, and it cannot be allowed to happen again. But the way that we're going to do it is not going to be to withdraw, to take our marbles and go home and say we're not going to play, but in fact, to get back in there and to work with our partners and allies to lead. And somewhat of an example of this, again, is in the World Intellectual Property Organization, where the US worked very hard to deny China's leadership and to help the Singaporean candidate become the head of that organization. And I think, it's just one example, but I do think you're right. I mean, we need to be engaged in order to make the changes. It's also true, I hope, frankly, that the fact that the rest of the world can look at this 3.5-year period of the Trump administration and realize that it cannot rely on the United States, right, necessarily, that this will empower other actors, right, other democracies in particular, to step up and to assume or to push for a greater, stronger leadership role. And I think we've seen that happen in smaller areas where the Trump administration is withdrawn, and the Canadians or the Netherlands or other countries have stepped in to the breach. But I think it's going to need to happen on a much more sustained way as well.
Sorry, but why do we need to wait for a Biden administration for this? I was asking if the academia and the establishment cannot point out the dysfunctionality of this approach, and even under Trump, an alternative approach. Sorry.
Unfortunately, these are a few areas where the president has pulled the plug, and the academy, no matter its, the hue and cry that has been raised, and even whatever, people within the administration, right, are pushing back against these kinds of actions, cannot seem to reason with him. And this happens. I mean, frankly, we can't even get our president to wear a mask, right? So, I don't know what you expect.
Saurabh, we'll get back to you for your second question if time permits later.
Thank you.
We have a very long list of people waiting to ask question. May I now invite General Prabir Chakravarti to ask his question. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Well, thanks a lot, Elizabeth, for a beautiful lecture. I have a very simple question. I've often read and you often suggest that the biggest enemy of the Communist Party are the Chinese people themselves. And you brought out exactly what Xi Jinping is doing towards this. Do you think Xi Jinping will remain in power with all this going on and with the United States companies also moving out? Because one thing that the party has been using is the economy to keep control of China. What's your view?
So, sorry, for me, your voice came in and out a little bit. The question is whether or not Xi Jinping is going to be able to stay in power, or whether there are going to be forces that get him out? Is that basically the question?
Yeah? Yes, that's the basic question.
Okay. Yes. So, of course, the answer is I don't know. But I do think, we've seen at a few points in time in the recent past that he has come under pressure. There have been reports that, the former leaders, Jiang Zemin, Zhu Rongji, Hu Jintao, and others have stepped up and spoken with members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo to say that Xi Jinping has moved too far, alienated the United States. I think it's an area, frankly, where it could be important, and this goes to the point that I made earlier about framing, a relationship between the United States and India around norms, and not around just an anti-China framework. I think it's particularly important in this context that everything not be understood as a competition between the United States and China. So to the extent that the international community brings pressure to bear on China, to the extent that it weakens Xi Jinping, I think it comes from a collection of countries and not from the United States leading the charge. Because when it's the United States leading the charge, China simply, and Xi Jinping simply says, this is just about the United States trying to contain China. But when you have many other countries, India and European countries and smaller countries, sort of rising up and saying, your behavior is not acceptable. When ASEAN as a collective says, we don't recognize, your 9-dash line, or when small island states say to China, you need to do something more on climate change. All of these things, I think they're powerful international tools for weakening Xi Jinping. So I think it's very easy for him just to use the United States to rally nationalism. So I think that's one source. And the second source is, I think, what you were also suggesting, which is, the Chinese people themselves. And here, you can hardly blame the Chinese people for, not standing up and protesting. I mean, the degree to which he has been able to put, this domestic security apparatus, into place. I mean, it's extraordinary, really. I look back to 2011, before he came to power, and the really vibrant civil society that was present on the Chinese internet. There were calls for political reform. You had all this environmental activism taking place. It was like an entirely different country, at that point in time. Of course, it wasn't an entirely different country, but it could appear, at least you had so many different voices. Again, I think those voices are all still there. But we've seen in this pandemic period that even when they come out and they push, that Xi Jinping still retains the power to squash them. So I'm not enormously optimistic that Xi Jinping is going to be out anytime soon, but I don't put the percentage, chance at 0.
Thanks. Thank you. For next question, I'll go to Professor Hemant Adlakha. Hemant, can you unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yeah, thank you. Hello, Dr. Economy. It was a very fascinating presentation on such a huge and important topic in such a short time. But I would like to draw your attention to one aspect which did not figure in the discussion so far, and that is China and Russia coming together. And also, I mean, maybe, I don't know, because it's not considered important in the American discourse, or, I mean, I'm asking this thing because there's something very interesting which has happened 3 days ago in Beijing. The Russian embassy in Beijing, in a Weibo post in Chinese, sent a message celebrating the 160th anniversary of Vladivostok. And that became a very controversial message, and it enraged many Chinese, especially the strategic affairs commentators, because in the message, Vladivostok was also mentioned in Chinese by the Chinese name before it became Vladivostok during Qing Dynasty. So it resulted in many commentators writing angrily about it. And in fact, some of them also mentioned openly that Russia was and is and will remain China's enemy more than Japan and the US. So I would like you to comment on that. Thank you.
So thank you. I think Russia-China is an important issue in the United States, and there's a lot of discussion about it, and there are some pretty prominent US thinkers and analysts who often argue that the United States should do more to reset the relationship with Russia, to try to bring Russia back into the fold, to split it off from China somehow. Most people think that this is not particularly likely to happen. Xi Jinping, probably maybe 2 years ago, he was giving a speech in Russia where he said that Vladimir Putin was his best friend in the international community. So I used to say that in my talks just to poke at President Trump, because President Trump was always talking about how Xi Jinping was his great friend. But I think there are two different levels here. I think there remains, I think, a degree of distrust at the popular level between Russians and Chinese. But at the senior most levels, I think, and concerned within Russia probably about sort of the degree to which Russia has become a kind of junior partner, particularly in the economic sphere to China. And as China continues to develop, for example, its own weapons capabilities, that aspect of Russian sort of superiority is also being much diminished. So I think that there's, and Russia subsumed its Eurasian Economic Union largely within the context of the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think there is this element within Russia. But I was in Russia maybe 3 years ago. I have to say I was surprised at the extent to which I didn't find much interest in sort of breaking away from China, actually, and a lack of concern about this sort of junior partner status. I think Russia maintains sort of on the strategic level, for example, in the Middle East, they seem to have carved out a kind of, Russia as a strategic player, as a security military player, China as the economic player. And of course, they agree on a lot and have for a long time within the United Nations. They're almost always together. Russia doesn't criticize China on the South China Sea. China doesn't criticize Russia on Crimea. So it may be a marriage of some convenience, and it also may be structured around an anti-US platform to a large extent. And it may fracture at some point. I don't dismiss that as a possibility. But I think for now, the forces that bring them together certainly seem to be stronger than the ones that are likely to pull them apart, no matter the level of sort of societal, like, you know, as I said, distrust or lack of partnership.
Thanks, Liz. We have actually nearly 20 questions in the chat box. But since we are running out of time, I'm afraid we won't be able to, give opportunity to everyone. What I'll do, I'll read out, 3 of the questions which are there, and I'll request Liz to keep your answers, relatively brief because time left is very short. So first question is from Ambassador Vijay Nambiar. His question is, how do you see the recent comment by Susan Shirk that she's re-examining her earlier assumptions that the cooperation with China under Xi Jinping? Is this view widely shared among other China scholars, or is it exceptional? This is one question. Would like to answer one by one, or can I combine some questions?
I'll go fast.
Okay, go ahead then. Go ahead. Why don't you respond?
So I think no, Susan, I know her interview in PBS NewsHour. I sent her a note saying that I thought it was a really great interview. Look, I think in many respects, there are 2 different camps. Susan kind of straddled the 2. I'm more in one, the sort of 200 people that signed on to the Washington Post letter saying that US policy is too tougher in another. And Susan was kind of in between. And I think the amount of information coming at US right now in terms of Chinese malign activities really does force many of those people who kind of straddled to move to one side. So I don't think she is in any way unique in this respect. I think it should be impossible for people to ignore what's going on with Xi Jinping and China and the policies.
Okay, the next question is by Dr. G. Venkat Raman. Venkat would like to know, how will US balance the China given its ambitions to become an Asian hegemon and simultaneously pursuing the US first policy approach?
Sorry, you totally froze. You froze in the middle of the question. So what was the question again? Sorry.
Okay, let me repeat. Sorry, the connectivity is a little poor. How will US balance the task of containing China given its ambitions to become an Asian hegemon and simultaneously pursuing the US first policy approach?
So I think what we've seen out of the Trump administration is that, again, it's about denying China. So while the United States doesn't necessarily, well, President Trump doesn't necessarily want to lead the world, that first of all, many of his advisors, his primary advisors and Congress do want the United States to retain that role. And so again, while President Trump maintains this very narrow focus on his trade issue and secondarily and much more distantly now North Korea, all of these other players continue to push forward, the military and others, on this effort to ensure that the United States retains a primary role in East Asia and on the global stage. So I think they do it by running around President Trump. And as long as their aims don't directly conflict with what he wants, they seem to be able to continue to push forward with the policies that are necessary to maintain some degree of US leadership in the region.
Thanks. Our next question is from Arun in chat box. Arun would like to know, to what extent would US be able to bring Europe along in its approach to China, or will Europe forge a different course on China?
So I would say this. I think the United States has really done a great job of alerting the world to the challenges that China poses and to this sort of new China under Xi Jinping. It has not done necessarily a great job in its diplomatic outreach. Of course, the president is terrible because he treats our allies and partners the same way that he treats China, sometimes even worse than he treats China. Nonetheless, I think we've begun to see in a number of countries, in Europe, shifts, from the UK to Greece, other countries now on the Huawei issue, for example. Many countries are starting to follow I don't want to say the US lead. I mean, Japan and Australia banned Huawei before we even started talking about it. So I think that if you can move past the president's ugly rhetoric and lack of diplomacy, I think the alarm bells that the United States has rung do seem to resonate in certain sectors of different European polities and cause them, again, to take a second look and to make different decisions. And so I think this is important. And Congress also, has moved forward with this interparliamentary group on democracy. And I don't know whether India is part of it or not. It's not just with the Europeans, but I think this is a very important initiative. Again, so across Congress and members of parliament globally, right? Democracies uniting, right? To talk about, to think about, and to coordinate policy on China. Because, legislators play an important role, obviously, in sort of thinking and discussing and debating foreign policy. So I think, can we bring Europe along? Europe is going to make its own determinations, its own decisions, and country by country, it's a little bit different. But I would say that right now, the landscape from the US perspective in Europe is much better than it was, say, a year ago with regard to China.
Thanks, Liz. There is a question from Manjushri. She would like you to comment on what's US policy on China's agenda of territorial expansionism.
What's the US agenda?
No, what is US stance on China's agenda of territorial expansionism?
Yeah, US stance is stop, and push back, perhaps not as effectively as we would like. China managed to, name 80 new artificial features, 55 of which are underwater in the South China Sea in the midst of the pandemic. And, it's pressing forward with its claims. But again, gradually, more and more countries seem to be becoming aware of China's expansionism, of its flouting of international norms and international law, and sort of being willing to step up and to engage. And I think that is just critically important. It just cannot be all about the United States pushing back by itself, not only because we don't have enough power to make a difference, but also because it just it makes it too easy for China. And so I think it's really about bringing allies and partners into this game on a normative framework.
Okay, the last question is from Tanishka. She would like you to comment on US-China Cold War and whether it can become a nuclear weapons race between the two countries.
Oh, I certainly hope not. It doesn't actually seem to be moving in that direction right now. And I think the Biden administration will get back on top of the nuclear issue when it comes to power, hopefully in November. But I am concerned about this hardening of lines that's taking place right now. And if we don't get a new administration in November, I am concerned about the potential for, again, there not to be, any way out of this, downward spiral. I'm all in favor of very tough policy toward China, but I'm not in favor of, some form of a Cold War emerging where, we have such limited forms of engagement and, limited opportunities to think about global challenges, et cetera. So we'll have to wait to see. But I don't think that's not an issue, I would say right now, that we have to add to all the other issues of concern in the United States about the state of the relationship with China. So hopefully we're not going to have to add that one in the near future.
Thanks. Thank you. Well, we still have about 10 questions, but we have really run out of time. So I must apologize to others who wanted to raise questions. Liz would like to make any concluding remarks?
No, just thank you so much to everybody for your great questions. I have to say, sometimes in my trips to India, I come from China to India. And when I get to India, it's like everything blossoms. It's not just all the flowers, but it's also just the creativity, the openness of thought, the debate, the argumentativeness, which wasn't on display here, but I really just enjoy, engaging with all of you. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Liz. It was really a great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar this evening. As we mentioned earlier, we would like you to come to India in person before too long. Let's hope that the present pandemic situation eases up and it becomes possible for you to return to India for another trip. Thank you very much. I'll not try to sum up your remarks because your presentation and your answers to a large number of questions which have been raised have been so rich, textures, nuanced, that it will be futile on my part to try and sum up and or even try to bring out what are the major takeaways of your remarks. But let me just tell all the participants that the proceedings of this webinar have been live streamed through YouTube, and the recording will be kept both on our social media platforms and website, as also on social media platforms of our media partner, The Print. So you can refer to the recording at your leisure in future as well. Thank you very much, Dr. Elizabeth Economy, for making it possible to deliver the 14th Giri Deshingkar Memorial Lecture. As Professor Sharan brought out, we have a very distinguished list of speakers at this prestigious annual lecture, and your lecture has been most befitting one, keeping in line with the very distinguished speakers we had in the past. So thank you very much. And let me thank all the participants for joining us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.